The security badge burned in my palm. Stolen in a fight I barely won. My own brother filed my death certificate, and now his lawyer just served me papers to silence me forever. The brass briefcase in my hand is my only weapon against the empire that was once mine. They erased me. Tonight, I carve my name back into existence. The hotel doors won't open. My bank cards won't work. The man who should recognize me just called me a ghost. I'm holding a watch that was supposed to be an apology. Now it's the only proof I'm still alive. And Julian? He's smiling. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi ignited like heat lightning against the peninsula's marble columns. Sarah Sterling smoothed the silk of her vintage gown, the fabric cool and heavy against her skin. The scent of expensive lilies and rain-damp pavement swirled in the humid air, thick enough to coat the back of her throat. She reached for the heavy brass handle of the ballroom door, her heart drumming a steady, frantic rhythm against her ribs. But a hand caught her elbow. The grip was iron, immovable. Miller stepped out from the shadows of a stone alcove. His tuxedo looked impeccable, yet his eyes carried a sharpened edge that stopped her breath. He was a massive man, his neck thicker than his head, standing with a practiced, robotic rigidity. Sarah felt the heat of his presence, a wall of muscle blocking the path to her own legacy. "The guest list changed, Sarah," he said. His voice barely rose above the hum of idling limousines. As he spoke, a low, gravelly sound vibrated from his chest. A funeral dirge hummed under his breath that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. Sarah pulled her arm away, her fingers instinctively diving into the hidden pocket of her gown. She found the small, smooth river stone and began the pattern. Tap, 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 tap. The rhythmic click against her thigh was the only thing keeping her from screaming. "My father is waiting inside. Move." Miller didn't budge. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded sheet of government-grade parchment. He held it out, the paper crisp and white under the street lamps. "Your father isn't waiting for a ghost." She snatched the document. Her eyes raced over the official seal of the registrar, landing on her own name printed in bold, clinical black. Below it, the word "deceased" sat beside a timestamp from 3 years ago, citing a hiking accident in the Swiss Alps. "This is a clerical error," she whispered, the paper crinkling in her tightening grip. "I'm standing right here. I just flew in from London." "Look at me, Miller. Legally, you aren't." Miller leaned in, his cologne a suffocating mix of sandalwood and copper. "The accounts are frozen. The Sterling identity belongs to the estate now. You're a trespasser in your own life." The heavy doors creaked open behind them, releasing a burst of laughter and the swell of a cello concerto. Sarah stared at her reflection in the polished glass. A woman in a shimmering dress who, according to the world, no longer existed. The world was continuing without her, a party for a dead woman's brother. And she was standing on the wet pavement of Chicago, a ghost in a silk shroud. She turned away from the golden light of the lobby, her heels clicking a hollow sound against the concrete. The city felt like a gray monolith, the skyscrapers pressing down on her shoulders like lead weights. She needed a witness. She needed someone who hadn't been bought by the Sterling machine. "Sarah." The voice was thin, reedy, and laced with a habitual tremor. She turned to see Marcus Reed standing near a flickering streetlight. He looked smaller than she remembered, his posture slumped as if he were trying to occupy as little space as possible. He was picking at the cuff of his jacket, his eyes darting toward the hotel entrance and then back to her. "Marcus," she breathed, stepping toward him. "You have to help me. Miller, he has a paper. It says I'm dead." Marcus didn't look surprised. He looked terrified. I know, right? I mean, we all saw the filing 3 months ago. It's just a small patch, you know? A temporary fix for the board, right? He ended every sentence with a desperate plea for validation, his voice trailing off as he checked the shadows behind him. A patch? Marcus, this is my life. Julian did this, didn't he? Marcus stepped closer, the smell of stale coffee and nervous sweat clinging to him. Julian has consolidated everything, Sarah. He's turned Sterling Logistics into a fortress. He's obsessed with the purity of the brand, you know? He says the family name needs to be scrubbed clean. He's ruthless now. If you go in there, you're not just a guest. You're a bug in the code, right? And Julian? He doesn't like bugs. Sarah's thumb worked the stone in her pocket. Tap, 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 tap. I have shares, Marcus. I have the majority if I can just prove who I am. You don't understand, Marcus whispered, his eyes widening. He's been waiting for you to show up. This wasn't a mistake. It was a lure. You're a target now, Sarah. You're the only defect left in his perfect system. Before she could respond, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed from the hotel's side entrance. 2 men in dark, ill-fitting suits emerged. Security thugs, their faces as expressionless as stone. They didn't call out. They simply began to close the distance, their movements synchronized and predatory. Go, Marcus hissed, but he didn't move to help. He backed away into the darkness of an alley, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender to the world. Sarah didn't wait. She lunged toward the service corridor, her vintage gown snagging on a metal trash bin. The air in the narrow passage was damp and smelled of old grease and stagnant water. The walls were so close she could feel the rough bricks scraping against her shoulders. Miss Sterling, one of the men called out, his voice a flat, metallic rasp. Mr. Sterling would like a word. Privately. They cornered her near a locked delivery door. The only light came from a buzzing red exit sign mounted upside down above them. Sarah felt the cold bite of fear, but beneath it, a spark of the old Sterling fire ignited. She wasn't a curator of artifacts anymore. She was a woman fighting for her pulse. She gripped the handle of her heavy brass briefcase, the one containing her restoration tools and the vintage watch meant for Julian. As the first man reached for her, she didn't scream. She swung, the brass corner of the case connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. He stumbled back, a spray of dark blood hitting the white-tiled wall. The second man lunged, his fingers locking around her throat. Sarah felt the air vanish, the world tilting into a blur of red and gray. She drove her knee upward, catching him in the solar plexus. He wheezed, his grip loosening just enough for her to bring the briefcase down on his crown. He slumped to the floor, the sound of his head hitting the concrete echoing like a hammer blow. Sarah stood over them, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her gown was torn, her hair a mess, but she was alive. She looked down at the unconscious guard. A plastic security badge hung from a lanyard around his neck. She ripped it off, the plastic snapping loudly in the quiet corridor. This was her key. It wouldn't get her into the vault, but it would get her past the internal sensors that were currently screaming her death to the world. Using the badge, she slipped through a service elevator and ascended to the 3rd floor, the executive lounge. She knew Julian would be there, away from the peasants he so despised, preparing for his big moment. She found the door to the private lounge. It was a room of smoked glass mirrors and bitter, unnatural cold. The AC was humming a low, mechanical drone. Julian sat in a high-backed leather chair, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand. Beside him stood Robert Vance, the family lawyer, his silver hair gleaming under the recessed lights. Vance was staring at the ceiling, his lips moving silently as he counted the tiles. 144, Vance muttered, before lowering his gaze to Sarah. He didn't blink. He simply adjusted his gold watch. Julian didn't stand. He offered a thin, bloodless smile. You're vibrating, Sarah. It's such a frantic little rhythm. Why don't we put the stone away and discuss the inheritance like the royalty we were born to be? You killed me, Julian, Sarah said, her voice trembling despite her efforts. On paper, you erased me. We found ourselves in a rather delicate entanglement of interests, Julian said, his voice a languid, predatory crawl. The transition required a certain level of purity. A dead sister is a tragic legacy. A living one with questions is a liability. Vance stepped forward, producing a thick blue folder. He laid it on the mahogany table with the precision of a surgeon. This is a non-disclosure agreement and a formal acknowledgement of your new identity. You will be provided with a comfortable stipend and a home in New Mexico. In exchange, Sarah Sterling remains in the grave. If you refuse, we have a warrant for your arrest for trespassing and the assault of 2 security officers. You can't do this, Sarah whispered. We already have, Julian replied, leaning in until she could see the clinical-grade sanitizer sheen on his skin. The world believes the lie because the lie is cleaner than the truth. Don't be tedious, little bird. Take the cage, or take the cell. Sarah looked at the mirrors. She saw a dozen versions of herself, all broken, all fragmented. She realized then that Julian wasn't just taking her money. He was taking her reflection. I'm not signing anything, she said, her thumb hitting the stone. Tap, 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 tap. Julian's smile vanished. He reached for the sleek black phone on the table. I'm disappointed in our lack of synchronicity. Officer Thompson is already downstairs. He's very eager to meet the woman who thinks she's a ghost. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, a low, rising howl that vibrated through the floorboards. Sarah backed toward the door, the stolen security badge heavy in her palm. This isn't over, she said. My dear, Julian called out as she turned to run. It was over the moment you stepped off the plane. You're just the last one to hear the eulogy. Sarah burst through the lounge doors and sprinted for the stairs. She could hear the heavy tread of boots on the marble below. Officer David Thompson would be leading the charge. Young, eager, and convinced he was the hero of the story. She could almost smell the starch on his uniform and the lucky socks he undoubtedly wore for the occasion. She found Marcus waiting in the shadows of the hotel's rear alleyway. He looked like he wanted to bolt, his eyes darting toward the street where a police cruiser was already skidding to a halt. We have to go, right? I mean, they're coming, you know. Marcus stammered, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys to a battered sedan. Drive, Marcus, just drive. They tore away from the curb just as Thompson rounded the corner, his hand on his duty belt. The rain began to fall in earnest then, a cold, needle-like drizzle that blurred the neon signs of the loop into smears of red and blue. He froze the accounts, Marcus said, his voice cracking as they wove through the gridlock. I checked the back end while you were inside. The offshore stuff, the Cayman accounts you thought were hidden, they're gone. Julian didn't just lock the door. He moved the whole house, right? Sarah felt a hollow ache in her chest. Everything she had built, the safety net she'd woven over 10 years, had been unraveled in a single night. She was penniless in a city that ate the poor for breakfast. I have to get back to the estate, she said, her voice hardening. My original birth certificate, my mother's jewelry, There are things in the wall's safe that Julian doesn't know about. The Lake Forest place? Marcus shook his head. That's a fortress now, you know. It's not a home anymore, right? It's my home, Sarah snapped. And I'm the only one who knows how to get in without triggering the silent alarms. The drive to Lake Forest was a blur of gray highway and rhythmic windshield wipers. The estate sat behind massive wrought iron gates, the stone house looking like a tomb under the moonless sky. The air here smelled of freshly cut grass and gasoline, the scent of a violent cleanup. Sarah slipped through the servant's entrance, her fingers knowing the sequence of the keypad by heart. The house was silent, but it was a heavy, expectant silence. She made her way to the library, her heart hammering. She moved the portrait of her father, her fingers searching for the cold steel of the safe. Her hand met empty space. The wall had been carved out. The safe was gone, leaving only a jagged hole in the plaster and a pile of white dust on the Persian rug. A low growl vibrated from the corner of the room. Sarah froze. Her childhood dog, a golden retriever named Buster who used to sleep at her feet, was standing by the window. But he wasn't wagging his tail. His hackles were raised, his eyes reflecting a terrifying, predatory light. He didn't recognize her. To him, she was just another intruder in Julian's house. "Buster, it's me," she whispered. The dog lunged, his teeth snapping inches from her hand. Sarah scrambled back, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked at the desk and saw a fresh bouquet of lilies, her favorite, sitting in a crystal vase. They smelled like a funeral. There was a card tucked into the stems. "Rest in peace, Sarah." She fled the house, the dog's barking echoing through the hollow halls like a death knell. She reached the car just as a black SUV turned into the driveway, its high beams blinding her. "They found us! They found us, right?" Marcus screamed, slamming the car into reverse. The SUV didn't slow down. It rammed into the side of the sedan with a deafening crunch of metal on metal. Sarah's head hit the window, the world splintering into white sparks. "Drive!" she yelled, clutching her shoulder as Marcus floored it, the tires screaming against the asphalt. The chase tore through the rainy streets of the loop. The SUV was relentless, a shadow that refused to be shaken. They swerved through intersections, the screech of metal on metal drowning out the roar of the L train above. Every digital billboard they passed seemed to flicker with a file not found error. The blue light washing the streets in a ghostly digital pallor. "I can't lose them. They're too fast, you know." Marcus was sobbing now, his knuckles white on the wheel. "The construction site on 4th, Sarah commanded. "The ground is uneven. They can't use their weight there." Marcus swung the car into the skeletal frame of an unfinished skyscraper. The tires bounced over jagged debris and exposed rebar. The SUV followed, but its bulk was a disadvantage. It bottomed out on a pile of gravel, the engine roaring in frustration. Sarah jumped out of the car before it even stopped. She ran into the dark heart of the site, her boots slipping on the muddy plywood. Behind her, she heard the heavy thud of a car door and the rhythmic clicking of a weapon being readied. She scrambled up a ladder to the second floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. A man emerged from the shadows, a professional, his face obscured by a tactical mask. He moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Sarah's hand went to her briefcase. She reached inside and pulled out the flare gun she'd kept for emergencies during her travels in the bush. She didn't aim for the man. She aimed for the stack of chemical drums and dry timber behind him. The flare ignited with a brilliant, blinding hiss. It struck the timber, and a wall of orange flame erupted instantly. The heat was a physical blow, the smell of scorched dust filling the air. The kidnapper recoiled, the fire reflecting in his goggles. In the chaos, Sarah slipped through a gap in the hoarding and vanished into the night. Hours later, she sat in a 24-hour diner, her hands shaking as she held a cup of black coffee. She pulled the stolen security badge from her pocket and laid it on the Formica table. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, she saw a detail she had missed in the dark of the corridor. The logo on the badge wasn't the interlocking S of Sterling Logistics. It was a stylized hawk, the mark of Vance and Associates. "He's not just the lawyer," Sarah whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "He's the architect. Julian didn't come up with the legal erasure. Vance did." Vance, the man who counted tiles to keep the world in order, had found a way to treat a human life like a typo. "We have to hit the mainframe," she told Marcus, who was huddled in the booth across from her, his thumb bleeding where he'd picked at the cuticle. "The charity auction tomorrow night. It's televised. It's the only time the biometric locks will be open for the public interface. If I can get to the podium, I can trigger the override." "That's suicide, right? I mean, the security will be everywhere, you know." "It's not suicide, Marcus. It's a restoration, and you're going to help me." The next evening, the city of Chicago felt like a trap waiting to spring. The morning headlines had already branded Sarah a disturbed grifter, her face plastered across every news cycle. A citywide manhunt was underway, led by a relentless Officer Thompson. Sarah and Marcus hid in a derelict warehouse on the edge of the river. The air smelled of old grease and stagnant water. Marcus sat hunched over a laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. "I've got the window," he whispered. "The gala's firewall has a 30-second reset when the live broadcast starts. If you're at the podium, then you can upload the data. But Sarah, if you miss it, there's no second chance, right?" "I won't miss it." Suddenly, the heavy steel doors of the warehouse groaned on their hinges. A blinding light cut through the darkness. Julian Sterling stepped into the room, flanked by 4 men in tactical gear. Behind them stood Officer Thompson, looking confused but determined. "Sarah," Julian said, his voice a melodic threat. "We've tracked the signal. Did you really think Marcus could hide from me?" "Julian, stop this," Sarah said, her hand moving to the stone in her pocket. Tap, 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 tap. "Give me the drive, Sarah, the one with the stolen data. We can still make this go away. A quiet facility in the mountains. No more running." Sarah looked at Marcus. He was staring at his keyboard, his shoulders shaking. "I'm not giving you anything," Sarah said. She reached for a lever on the wall, the emergency fire suppression system. She pulled it with all her might. A thick, white fog of chemical powder erupted from the ceiling, filling the warehouse in seconds. It was a blinding, suffocating cloud. Sarah moved through the whiteout like a wraith. She heard a shout, a scuffle, and the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. She lunged for one of the corrupt officers, her fingers finding the cold metal of his sidearm. She twisted it from his grip and shoved him into the darkness. The thick vapor allowed her to move unseen, the world reduced to a series of muffled sounds and ghostly shapes. She made it to the back exit, her lungs burning. She turned to grab Marcus. "Marcus, come on!" But Marcus wasn't moving. He was standing by the laptop, the fog clearing around him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Julian. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice flat and devoid of its usual tremor. "It's just... Vance offered me a seat at the table, you know? A real seat? Not just a patch, right?" He picked up the primary laptop, the one containing all of Sarah's evidence, and slammed it onto the concrete floor. The plastic shattered, the internal components crunching under his heel. "Marcus?" Sarah whispered, the betrayal hitting her harder than any physical blow. "He's been on the payroll since the London trip, Sarah," Julian said, stepping out of the fog. He looked perfectly clean, not a speck of powder on his suit. "He was the one who told us where to find you at the hotel. He was the one who lured you here." Julian stepped forward and grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip bruising. He dragged her toward a small, reinforced door in the corner of the warehouse basement. "Wait, Julian." He shoved her inside. The room was a concrete box, the ceiling so low she had to hunch her shoulders. "The gala starts in 10 minutes, Julian said, his voice echoing in the small space. "Enjoy the show, little bird." He slammed the heavy iron door. Sarah heard the sequence of 6 different locks clicking into place, all from the outside. A small wall monitor flickered to life in the corner of the cell. The broadcast had begun. Julian was on screen, looking radiant under the crystal chandeliers of the ballroom. He was standing at a podium, a black ribbon on his lapel. "Tonight," Julian told the millions of viewers, "we honor the memory of my sister, Sarah, a woman whose spirit was as vibrant as the artifacts she restored. Though she is gone, her legacy lives on in the Sterling Foundation." Sarah slumped against the cold stone wall, the sound of the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of a leaking pipe the only company she had. She was trapped, she was erased, and the world was applauding her murderer. The water began to pool around her ankles. The pipe hadn't just been leaking, it had burst, the cold, dark water rising with terrifying speed. She looked at the ventilation grate high on the wall. It was rusted, the screws loose. She was a curator. She knew the structural weak points of old buildings. She knew how to find the one loose stone that would bring down a wall. She grabbed a discarded metal pipe from the floor and began to pry at the grate. Her fingers bled, the cold water rising to her waist. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The grate gave way with a screech of protesting metal. Sarah hauled herself into the narrow, cramped duct, the smell of dust and old copper filling her nose. She crawled through the darkness, her vintage gown tearing away until she was left in her silk slip, her skin scraped and bruised. She followed the sound of the music, the cello concerto, the laughter. She emerged into the ballroom's ceiling crawl space, looking down through the crystal facets of the massive chandelier. Below her, Julian was still speaking. She dropped. She landed on the velvet-covered stage with a thud that silenced the room. She looked like a ghost, pale, bloodied, and fierce. The paparazzi's flashbulbs ignited, a wall of white light. Miller lunged for her, but she was faster. She reached the podium before he could touch her. "I'm not a memory," she screamed into the microphone, her voice echoing through the hall. She didn't try to prove her identity with words. She knew the machine would only listen to one thing. She leaned over the high-tech scanner on the podium, the biometric lock her father had installed years ago as a dead man's switch. She pressed her eye to the lens. The screen on the wall behind her didn't flash red. It turned a brilliant, steady green. Identity confirmed. Sarah Sterling. A video began to play on the massive screens. It wasn't a tribute. It was a recording from the Sterling Logistics boardroom 3 years ago. "The plane crash was too messy, Robert." Julian's voice filled the room, cold and clinical. "The brakes on the Lake Forest car would have been cleaner. But as long as my parents are gone, the shares are ours." "The paperwork is already filed, Julian," Vance's voice replied. "We'll count the days until Sarah returns. Then we'll erase her too. 144 days of mourning. Then the empire is yours." The ballroom was silent. Even the air seemed to freeze. Julian turned toward the screen, his face ashen. Vance was staring at the ceiling, his lips moving frantically. 1, 2, 3. Officer Thompson stepped onto the stage, but he wasn't looking at Sarah. He was looking at Julian. He reached for his handcuffs. "Julian Sterling," Thompson said, his voice trembling with a mix of shock and duty. "You're under arrest." Sarah stood at the podium, her breath coming in slow, steady draws. She watched as Miller was tackled by his own security team. She watched as Marcus Reed tried to slip out the back door, only to be blocked by a phalanx of reporters. She had won. The Sterling name was hers. The accounts would be unfrozen. The death certificate would be shredded. But as she stood there, the center of 1,000 flashing lights, she felt a hollow ache in her chest. She looked at the vintage watch lying on the floor, the peace offering she'd brought for a brother who had never existed. The Sterling legacy wasn't a throne, it was a graveyard. Subverted beat 4.3. Sarah stood in the center of the ballroom, the silence of the crowd more deafening than any applause. She waited for the rush of triumph, the surge of heat that comes with a hard-fought victory. She had done everything right. She had used her father's own paranoia, his dead man's switch, to dismantle the very empire he had built. She had exposed the rot at the heart of the family. This was the moment the hero was supposed to feel the weight lift from her shoulders. As the police led Julian and Vance away, Sarah watched her brother's back. He didn't look like a titan anymore. He looked like a small, broken man in an expensive suit. The purity he had craved was gone, replaced by the harsh, fluorescent reality of a police booking room. She looked at the faces of the donors, the socialites, the board members. They weren't looking at her with respect. They were looking at her with horror. She realized then that in exposing Julian, she had destroyed the Sterling name forever. The stock prices would plummet by morning. The logistics firm, the foundation, the history, it was all tainted by the blood of her parents. She hadn't just reclaimed her life. She had inherited a smoking ruin. The Sterling she had fought to be was a brand that now meant murderer and thief. The victory felt like ash in her mouth. She had spent years believing that if she could just prove she existed, the world would return to normal. But there was no normal to return to. Her parents were still dead. Her brother was a monster. Her best friend was a traitor. She stood in a room full of people, and she had never been more legally alive or more profoundly alone. The empire was hers, but the palace was empty, and the crown was made of lead. Sarah walked through the empty halls of Sterling Logistics later that night. The white-on-white aesthetic felt colder than ever. She made her way to the boardroom and sat in the heavy mahogany chair at the head of the table. She pulled the river stone from her pocket and placed it on the polished surface. It looked small and insignificant against the vast black pool of the table. She picked up the vintage watch. It was broken now, the glass shattered from the fall at the gala. The hands were frozen at 8:04 p.m., the moment she had officially come back to life. She thought about the old woman she had helped with the groceries weeks ago. The smell of lavender. The warmth of a hand that didn't want anything in return. She reached for the phone on the desk. She didn't call the lawyers. She didn't call the press. "This is Sarah Sterling," she said, her voice steady and quiet. "I want to begin the process of liquidating the estate. All of it. Every cent." She looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. The smog was clearing, the stars beginning to peek through the charcoal haze. The Sterling legacy was written in blood, her father had said. But Sarah decided, as she watched the sun begin to rise over the lake, that her own story would be written in something else. She left the stone on the table and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. For the first time in 3 years, she knew exactly who she was, and she didn't need a piece of paper to prove it.